mother-in-law handed me a household budget envelope every month for 4 years. I found out last week it was the interest on my own inheritance she'd been managing without my knowledge. The envelope was always the same, a standard white business envelope. My name written on the front in Diane's neat looping cursive. Always left on the kitchen counter on the first of the month. Always sealed. Always containing the same amount. $1,200 in cash. She called it a household budget. She said it with such practiced warmth, such easy generosity that I never once thought to question the framing. I thought she was helping us. I thought she was being kind. I thought for 4 years that I was lucky to have married into a family that looked after their own. I was wrong about almost everything. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and until 11 days ago, I would have described my life as quiet, steady, and genuinely good. I met my husband, James, at a university alumni event in Portland when I was 26. He was tall and careful with his words, the kind of man who listened when you talked and remembered things you mentioned once in passing. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in the Willamette Valley with 40 people and a reception on a vineyard patio and dancing that lasted until the staff started stacking chairs around us. I was happy. I was, as far as I knew, happy. James's mother, Diane Whitfield, had been widowed 6 years before we met. Her husband, Robert, had died of a cardiac event at 61, leaving behind a paid-off house in Lake Oswego, a comfortable life insurance policy, and, I would eventually learn, a substantial investment portfolio he built over 30 years in commercial real estate consulting. Diane was gracious and composed and had strong opinions about flower arrangements and very little tolerance for ambiguity. She called James every Sunday at 7 p.m. without fail, never late, never early, as if a call were itself a kind of discipline. She was generous in the way that makes you feel sometimes like the generosity has fine print. I had a small inheritance of my own. My grandfather, Walter Hess, had died when I was 23, leaving me a trust funded by the sale of his machine parts manufacturing business in Ohio. I didn't know the exact value because I had never needed to. Grandpa Walter had set it up quietly, as he did most things. He had named my mother as the initial trustee until I turned 30, at which point management was supposed to transfer to a financial institution of my choosing. My mother died of pancreatic cancer when I was 28. She died fast, the way the disease sometimes takes people, 3 months from diagnosis to the end, and in the fog of that grief, I had not thought carefully about the trust. I had not asked who was managing it. I had not confirmed the transfer had happened. I had assumed, because assuming was easier than asking, that everything was in order. I was wrong about that too. The first time I met Diane, James brought me to her house for Sunday dinner. She had made pot roast and a lemon tart and had set the table with cloth napkins. She looked at me the way women like her look at women like me when the son they raise brings someone home. Measuring, careful, not unkind, but taking inventory. She asked me about my work. I was in nonprofit communications at the time, grant writing and donor relations for a children's literacy organization. She said that sounded meaningful, which was the polite version of saying it sounded underpaid. She wasn't wrong. It was underpaid. After James and I married and bought our house in Southeast Portland, a 3-bedroom craftsman that needed more work than we'd admitted to ourselves when we made the offer, Diane started coming by regularly. She had opinions about the kitchen renovation and helpful suggestions about the bathroom tile and an ongoing relationship with a contractor named Gary, whom she trusted implicitly and whom she inserted into our renovation process with such smooth confidence that by the time I understood he was becoming our primary contractor, the decision had already been made. Gary did good work. I told myself it didn't matter how he'd ended up there. The envelope started about 3 months after we moved in. Diane came for dinner one Sunday, set the envelope on the kitchen counter while I was washing vegetables, and said, in the same tone she used for everything from weather observations to serious opinions, that she wanted to help with the household. $1,200 a month, she said, for groceries, utilities, whatever you need. Don't make it complicated. I looked at James. He shrugged in the way he did when he'd already agreed to something without quite telling me. I thanked her. She waved it off. That was how it went. Every month for 4 years, the envelope appeared. Sometimes she left it when she came to dinner. Sometimes James brought it home from a visit to her house. Once or twice, she left it in the mailbox when we weren't home. $1,200, always cash, always in that same white envelope with my name in her cursive. I put it toward groceries, toward utilities, toward the small repairs the house kept generating. I felt sometimes a faint discomfort about it, the kind of low-level unease that comes when someone's generosity makes you feel slightly managed rather than cared for. But I told myself I was being ungrateful. I told myself she was lonely, and this was how she stayed connected to James. I let it go. I should not have let it go. The first crack appeared last spring. James and I were doing our taxes, a process we handled jointly each year with a spreadsheet James built that he was quietly proud of. We were going through income and assets the way you do, and I mentioned offhand that I should probably check in with whoever was managing Grandpa Walter's trust, since I hadn't received a statement in over a year. James went quiet for a beat, the specific kind of quiet that isn't silence but hesitation. I noticed it. I didn't say anything anything then, but I noticed. I mentioned it again 2 weeks later, more directly. I said I wanted to contact the trustee, that I wasn't sure who was managing the account since the transfer point had passed and my mother was gone, and that I thought we should find out. James said he was sure everything was fine. He said it the way people say things when they already know what you're going to find and they don't want to be in the room when you find it. I called my grandfather's estate attorney, a man named Douglas Fenn, who had offices in Columbus and who had drawn up the original trust documents. He remembered me. He expressed sympathy about my mother. He then told me, in the careful way that attorneys use when they are trying to give you information that may be difficult, that a modification to the trustee designation had been filed approximately 3 years earlier, while I was 30, just past the transfer threshold. The modification named a new individual trustee, pending selection of a financial institution. The individual named was Diane Louise Whitfield, my mother-in-law. I sat with that for a long time after the call. The modification had been filed 6 weeks after my mother died. I had been 28, still inside the window when the original trustee terms applied. Still, technically, within a period when modifications required certain notices and consent procedures that Douglas told me carefully he had not been the one to process. The modification had been handled by a different attorney, a probate specialist in Portland named Gerald Cole, whose name I did not recognize. I did not go home directly after I found out. I drove to Laurelhurst Park and sat in my car for 45 minutes watching a man throw a tennis ball for a golden retriever who brought it back with complete sincerity every time, as if the return were the whole point. I thought about the envelope. I thought about 4 years of $1,200 in cash, handed over with such easy warmth, such practiced generosity. I thought about how it had never occurred to me to ask where the money came from. I had assumed because it came from Diane, that it came from Diane. It had not occurred to me that it might be coming from something that was mine. I want to be careful here about what I knew versus what I suspected versus what I have now confirmed. What I knew that afternoon in the parking lot was that Diane had been named trustee of my trust without my knowledge or meaningful consent during a period of my life when I was grieving and not paying careful attention. What I suspected, sitting in that car, was that the $1,200 monthly envelope was not a gift. What I have since confirmed through Douglas Fenn and through a forensic accountant named Helen Park, whom Douglas referred me to, is this. My grandfather's trust at the time of his death held approximately $1.1 million in diversified investments, properly managed over the intervening years, with a portfolio returns that were achievable in that period. The trust should have grown to somewhere between $1.6 and $1.9 million by the time I reached 30. The actual current value, as of last week's accounting, is $214,000. The difference, accounting for the legitimate management fees, portfolio fluctuation, and documented withdrawals, represents approximately $900,000 in funds that were dispersed in ways that Helen described to me in her precise, unhurried way as requiring explanation. The explanation, or the beginning of one, came from Gerald Cole's office records, which Douglas had subpoenaed as part of the preliminary legal review. Among the disbursements, a $180,000 payment to a contractor named Gary Marsh for renovation work on a Lake Oswego property. The Lake Oswego property is Diane's house. Gary Marsh is the contractor she had trusted implicitly and inserted into our own renovation. A $95,000 transfer to an account belonging to James Robert Whitfield, my husband, and 48 monthly payments of $1,200 logged in the disbursement records as household support, totaling $57,600. The envelope. For 4 years, Diane had been handing me my own money in cash installments and calling it generosity. I did not confront either of them immediately. I know that surprises people when I tell them, but I had learned something by that point from watching what I was dealing with. Diane did not do things carelessly. The trust modification had been filed correctly, or close enough to correctly that challenging it required specificity. The disbursements had been recorded, which meant she had been meticulous. Meticulous people are not undone by confrontation. They are undone by documentation. I spent 6 days not acting like anything had changed. I cooked dinner. I went to work. I let Diane come for Sunday dinner and watched her set the table with cloth napkins and talk about the garden she was putting in along the back fence. And I said the right things at the right moments. And I kept my face exactly as it had always been. It was the hardest thing I have done, and I am including in that comparison things that were objectively harder, because the hardness of it was a particular kind. The kind where you are performing normal while everything underneath has shifted and you cannot trust anyone in the room. The attorney Douglas referred me to for the civil matter was a woman named Ruth Anand. She was 52, sharp-featured, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had a manner of speaking that reduced complicated situations to their operative facts with a precision that was both reassuring and slightly frightening. She reviewed everything Douglas and Helen had sent over. She asked me 4 questions and then told me what we had. The trust modification, she said, was procedurally irregular. The consent documentation was thin. Combined with a disbursement pattern, the renovation payments to a contractor who also worked on Diane's property property and the transfer to James's account. She said the picture was one of sustained misappropriation by a fiduciary. Her words, sustained misappropriation by a fiduciary. She said it the way someone says a diagnosis. Clinically, precisely, without drama. What we are filing, she told me, is a breach of fiduciary duty claim, a petition for trust accounting, and a motion to remove the trustee. The transfers to James create a separate question that will need to be addressed. She looked at me steadily. Are you prepared for what that means? I said I was. I said it without flinching, and I meant it. And then I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. I told James the night before the papers were served. I thought about not telling him, about letting him be served the same way Diane was, about giving him no more warning than she would receive. I decided against it. Not out of softness, but because I needed to see his face when I told him. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with. I needed to know if he knew. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table after dinner and said quietly that I needed to tell him something. I told him about Douglas Fenn's call. I told him about Helen Park's accounting. I told him about the trust modification filed 6 weeks after my mother died. I told him about the $95,000 transfer to his account. He knew. I could tell in the first 3 seconds. The particular way a face reorganizes itself when it is moving from performance to something more unguarded. He had known for some time. Not all of it, he said when he finally spoke. Not how much. He said his mother had told him the trust had been restructured as a formality, that she was just the interim manager, that it was all proper. He said he'd assumed the money in his account was a family loan, something to be sorted out later. He said he had not asked questions because he hadn't wanted to know the answers. That last part, at least, I believed. Some people choose not to look because looking would require them to act, and acting would cost them more than the not looking. James was that kind of person. I had known that about him in a lower register for years. I had called it evenness. I had called it calm. I had mistaken conflict avoidance for steadiness and paid for the confusion. The papers were served the following morning at 9 a.m. Diane's at her Lake Oswego house. James's at his office, which Ruth said was more professional and also, I understood, more public. Diane called me 4 minutes after service. I answered on the second ring, which surprised her. She started speaking before she had fully composed herself, which told me that the service had rattled her more than she'd anticipated. She used the word family twice in the first sentence. She said she had been protecting my interests. She said the trust had been mismanaged before she took over. She said I didn't understand the full picture. I let her finish. When she was done, I said, Ruth Annan's office will be your point of contact from here. Please don't call this number again. Then I ended the call and put the phone face down on my desk and looked out the window at the parking lot for a full minute, doing nothing. Ruth had been right about the documentation. When the trust accounting was compelled through the court order, the records that came back were meticulous in the way that meticulous people construct records, with gaps in precisely the places where gaps are hardest to explain and easiest to obscure. The renovation payments were logged as trust expenses under a property maintenance provision that required a stretch of the original trust language that Ruth described as creative. The payment to James was logged as a loan, with a promissory note that had been backdated, sloppily, in a way that the forensic accountant identified within 4 hours. The $900,000 did not vanish. That is the thing about financial misappropriation when the person doing it is meticulous but not expert. The money moves, but it leaves tracks. Helen Park spent 3 weeks following the tracks. Some of it went to the renovation, some went to James, some went to a brokerage account in Diane's name that had been receiving small regular transfers for 38 months. Some went to what turned out to be a second property, a vacation cabin in Bend, Oregon, that Diane had purchased in cash in the 3rd year of her trusteeship and titled in her name alone. The Bend property was the thing that changed the tone of everything. Ruth had described the case before that as strong but civil. When Helen identified the cabin, Ruth used different language. She said it was no longer a question of civil recovery. She made a phone call that afternoon. The call was to the Oregon Department of Justice's Financial Fraud Unit. A week later, a woman named Agent Cressida Vout called my cell phone. She was professional and specific and asked me to send her the full accounting package. She said the matter would be reviewed under Oregon criminal statutes relating to financial elder and dependent abuse, which I found grimly ironic since the statute was designed to protect people from situations like the one Diane had engineered for me. She said the review would take time. She said to be patient. James moved out of the house 2 weeks after service. He moved into an apartment in the Pearl District, which I know because he told me, and which struck me as exactly the kind of choice someone makes when they want their circumstances to look different than they are. He hired a family law attorney and sent a letter through that attorney expressing his desire to resolve things amicably. Ruth forwarded it to me. I read it twice and filed it in the folder I had started keeping. We have not spoken directly since the night I told him at the kitchen table. He sent a text message 10 days after he moved out that said he was sorry and that he loved me and that he had made choices he regretted. It was a well-written text. I could tell he had worked on it. I saved it to the folder. The last Sunday dinner I had at Diane's house before all of this was in February. She had made roast chicken and a green salad and a chocolate cake she said she'd adapted from an old recipe of Robert's mother. We had eaten in the dining room with the cloth napkins and the good china. She had been warm and attentive and had asked about my work with the ease of someone who knows how to make dinner feel like a gift. I had driven home thinking that I was lucky. I had thought, looking at the lights of the city on the bridge, that I was a person who had landed somewhere good. I think about that drive sometimes now. I think about the distance between what I believed and what was true, and how completely it had been managed. Not carelessly, not sloppily, but managed deliberately by someone who understood that if the performance was good enough, and the documents careful enough, and the monthly envelope routine enough, no one would look. She had counted on my grief making me distracted. She had counted on James's avoidance making him complicit. She had counted on my gratitude making me blind. All three of those calculations had been accurate for a long time. Ruth says the civil recovery is strong. The Bend cabin alone, she told me last week, nearly covers the gap between what the trust should be worth and what it is. The brokerage account transfers are documented. The renovation payments are documented. The backdated promissory note is documented. The forensic accountant's report is 47 pages, and Helen Park, I have come to understand, does not write reports that lose cases. Agent Vaught's review is ongoing. Ruth says the criminal piece moves more slowly than the civil piece, which moves more slowly than I would like, but faster, she assures me, than it feels. Diane has retained a criminal defense attorney, and Agent Vaught's review is ongoing. Ruth says the criminal piece moves more slowly than the civil piece, which moves more slowly than I would like, but faster, she assures me, than it feels. Diane has retained a criminal defense attorney in addition to her civil counsel. The two attorneys have, according to Ruth, communicated in ways that suggest Diane's position is less confident than her public composure implies. The divorce filing is separate from all of this. Ruth referred me to a family law colleague named Serena Kotri, who handles the dissolution while Ruth handles the trust. Serena has the posture of someone who has seen every configuration of marital dissolution and finds none of them surprising. She looked at the transfer to James's account and told me what it meant for the asset division. She used the phrase unjust enrichment in a tone that meant she had already priced it into her strategy. What I keep coming back to in the quiet of the house, which feels different now that James is not in it, is the envelope, the specific physical fact of it. The white business envelope, my name in her cursive, the cash inside, $1,200 every month for 4 years. I had felt grateful. I had felt taken care of. I had called it generosity. To James, to friends, had said that Diane was generous, that she helped with the household, that we were lucky to have her. The money had come from my grandfather's trust. It had come from the interest, or part of it, filtered back to me in cash installments small enough not to raise questions, large enough to generate goodwill. It was, Helen explained, also partially a tax consideration, since cash disbursements of that size fell under reporting thresholds. That detail made me sit with my coffee going cold for a long time. Ruth says I should have access to the civil recovery within 18 months, possibly sooner depending on how Diane's attorneys approach the negotiation. She says Gerald Cole, the Portland probate attorney who filed the modification, has his own exposure and has been cooperative in ways that are useful to our case. She says the documentation is, in her assessment, the clearest fiduciary fraud she has seen in 12 years of practice, which she said without pride but with a quiet satisfaction of someone who prefers clarity to ambiguity. I am still in the house. I took the Monday after everything happened and repainted the living room a color I had wanted since we moved in and James had said was too dark. It is a deep, warm green, and it looks exactly right in the morning light, and I do not know why that matters as much as it does to me right now, but it does. I have started going through Grandpa Walter's papers, which I'd kept in a box in the closet since my mother died. Letters, mostly, some photographs, a few legal documents I'd never read carefully enough. He had a precise, small handwriting, the kind that people develop when they learn to write in an era when the paper was expensive and the pen was shared. He had written notes in the margins of documents he thought were important, in the margins of the original trust documents, in his small, careful script. He had written, "For Nora, only that, for Nora." I held that page for a long time. Ruth emails me when there are updates. Helen Park's final accounting report came last Thursday, and I read all 47 pages on a Friday evening with a glass of wine and the particular feeling of someone who has been handed back slowly and in installments the shape of something that was always theirs. The trust is still reduced. The process of recovering it is still underway. The criminal review is still pending. The dissolution is still moving, but the envelope is gone. And that, small as it sounds, is a thing I notice every first of the month when the kitchen counter is just a kitchen counter, and the only name written on anything is my own. Thanks for watching video. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos.